Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us for our webinar series and series of events that Synera and ANRC are putting on for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Synera and ANRC are companies, a part of the cyber risk management family of companies, and we focus on leveraging technology to mitigate risk in the changing business environment in the world today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common pitfalls that data analytics teams and data analytics projects face when they attempt to build out a program or implement a data analytics project. The content today really centers around a white paper that I recently wrote, focusing on this topic. So I would say if you have more interest in the topic and want to learn more, I'd encourage you to log on to Synera's website, download the white paper. We'll also be sending it out at the end of the session today. In addition, I really love to talk about this stuff. So if anybody has additional interest, I'm happy to schedule a time outside of this session offline and talk through strategies and ways to deal with some of these topics we're going to talk about today. So my name is Cliff Stevens, and I'm part of the National Data Analytics practice at Synera. I've really built my career on leveraging data analytics to solve business problems, mitigate risks in business and technology and finance, and then leveraging that data analytics technology, things like automation and visualization, to help drive out inefficiencies from processes within teams. So trying to find ways to streamline how teams are doing things, leveraging data analytics. I began my career at KPMG, spent some time there doing IT risk advisory services, leveraging data analytics in that area as well. And then spent almost 8 years at Home Depot within internal audit. A large portion of that time was focused on building out and then leading the data analytics efforts in the data analytics team within internal audit. We had really strong success in that group, leveraging things like I talked about, automation, visualization, getting into some advanced analytics, and really one of the keys was dashboarding. That's not to say that it was all successes, and we didn't sometimes learn by making some of these mistakes that we're going to talk about today. And I think that's how some of this conversation is shaped up, is just learning from past experiences and how to take some of these experiences and deliver better analytics projects, strategize on how to build out data analytics programs more effectively. And most recently, I took a role in the data analytics team at Synera, helping to advise companies around data analytics strategies when they're trying to build a team, trying to put a program in place, and then implementing those technologies on their teams to do exactly what we just talked about, to mitigate risks, to make those teams more efficient. So like I mentioned, today we're going to talk about some of the areas that I've come across in my experiences, some of the areas that I've discussed with colleagues and counterparts where companies are putting in place analytics programs, working on analytics projects, and they run into some very common issues when they're going through those efforts. So we're going to talk a little bit about the changing landscape of data analytics, the changing conversation around how audit should be thinking about data analytics, kind of justifying the rationale behind the conversation. We'll talk through the 5 main pitfalls that I write about in the white paper. Discussing some case studies along the way, trying to bring real-world examples into the conversation, and then a little bit around kind of what you could call the new frontier of data analytics and applying data analytics in the information security space. One thing I'd like to say before kind of a admin item is if there's any questions that come up along the way, feel free to type them into the chat window that you have in your GoToWebinar. And we'll break periodically throughout to try to make sure we get all of your questions answered. So, like I said, I wanted to talk through the landscape, how things are changing, and I think this slide really addresses how the audit profession is adapting, or maybe not adapting as they should be, to the availability of data analytics technologies and how they've been changing over the years. The really interesting thing to me is to think about how often you hear the data analytics conversation come up, and that conversation is exploding. And it's gone from kind of a not discussed topic to a point where every CAE that you talk to acknowledges that it's a critical factor that they need to be considering, they need to get good at to be better, to mitigate risk in companies and to do things more effectively. But then the really interesting thing to me is, though, that when you look at this slide and you see the data that shows that data analytics has really only grown somewhere between 7 and 14% between 2006 and 2015. So you kind of end up with a disconnect where the conversation is acknowledging the importance, it's growing rapidly, but there's a large quantity of teams that haven't implemented it effectively and aren't getting the real value out of it. So if you see in the chart down below, only about 50% of chief audit executives would say, that they have moderate to extensive use of analytics in an effective way in their organization. So like I said, we clearly have a disconnect in between this conversation and the real world application of data analytics. So this brings us to the first pitfall, and I think it's probably one of the most important and critical factors is getting buy-in at the executive level. Gaining that executive level sponsor in your organization, it's such an important step to help ensure that you have proper dedication of a couple things. One would be human capital, and then financial capital to apply to the data analytics initiative that you're pursuing. The other thing here I think that this really helps with is it ensures that changing priorities in the business and fire drills and things that come up along the way don't deprioritize the data analytics initiative. Because too many times I see companies say, we're going to dedicate resources, we're going to put forth our best foot into data analytics, and then something happens and the IT audit manager, whoever's responsible, gets pulled into something else and data analytics falls by the wayside. So the other thing here that I think is really important is not just getting an executive level sponsor within your organization or your business group. Too many companies just think in their silo. The real key here for me is get that executive level sponsor in your group, but also look outside. Look to groups like IT, HR, the business areas where you're going to be pulling data from, so that you can create that kind of collaborative support network when you're going through these data analytics initiatives, so you have the resources necessary, whether it be access to the data, assistance in solving dirty data problems, or just assistance from the business in helping you identify how to analyze the data in an effective way. The other thing I would say here is that too many data analytics initiatives or teams that are going through this process just think of IT as a resource to give them access to the data. There's so many resources in IT that can be so useful when you're developing analytics, whether it be a DBA that knows the tables or somebody that has access to data dictionaries or libraries that can be of assistance, or people in IT that know which fields can't be relied upon that will really help solve problems for you down the road in your efforts. So this is one of the first case studies we'll talk about around the pitfall of not getting enough buy-in, and the first one is kind of a good news story where there's a manufacturing company that had no data analytics team in place. They pitched the audit committee through their CFO for funding around a data analytics proof of concept or a pilot. They got approval for a very small amount of funding, and they picked an area which I think is a great idea, is to go after an area where they think the greatest financial opportunity is, and balancing that with the risk in the area. So identifying an area where there's maybe a suspected lack of control, there could be financial leakage, and it's an area that has a sizable financial opportunity behind it. So they implemented a duplicate payment analytic in this area, and with a fairly small budget, they actually ended up recovering almost 4 times the amount of money that they invested in implementing the project in the first place. And then the added benefit is they did it in the right way so that the analytic could be leveraged going forward. So not only did they get that initial financial windfall and ROI and payback, but they've now implemented a process, and analytic that they can run on a continuous basis going forward to continue to identify these financial benefits. Another area I think about, or example that I think about in this related to this pitfall, is some of my time back at Home Depot. And it was the first time we ever used data analytics. We didn't require funding because we had some ACL licenses just sitting around that nobody was using. And I got staffed on what we called gift card issuance project. And when you think about gift card issuance, it relates to customer satisfaction. So you're an unhappy customer, you call in, and you get issued a gift card for a certain amount of money to make you happy. Well, we would go in and look at this process to identify areas where there's risks. So I identified the opportunity to say, let's leverage our data analytics tools we have available to us, and we tested the whole population looking for anomalies, fraud, and trends, and things like that. And we ended up actually identifying both internal employee fraud, where they were issuing gift cards to themselves or to their friends, and also customer fraud, where customers were continuously calling with made-up stories about complaints to get a large volume of cards. So as you can imagine, that's, we were able to recover a good amount of those dollars, presented the results to the CFO and CAE, and they were completely blown away because we had never done any kind of data analytics project before with that kind of result. So from that point on, data analytics was I would say almost a requirement on every single project that audit delivered because of that initial success. And the other thing I would say is I would attribute that initial success to being the catalyst to create the snowball where data analytics became ingrained in the culture of the team. And actually, I would attribute it to the creation of a dedicated data analytics team within audit. So the next area is looking at data overload. And I'm sure everyone's heard the stats around how fast data volumes are growing across every type of business. In addition, it's not just simple, pretty structured databases and tables. There's a significant volume of unstructured data and a growing number of sources from where you can pull data. It's not, there's production tables, there's DB2 tables, there's Teradata, there's a Hadoop environment, Parexel. It's a growing struggle to identify what tables are needed, what's the correct source, what's the most accurate source. And it can become a pretty large challenge for an audit team that may not be familiar with those specific data sources. And it can almost lead to paralysis by analysis of where to get the data, which is most accurate. So I think, that's not a challenge that's going to go away because it continues to grow. But what I see as one of the solutions is that, or one of the problems is that too many teams budget far too little time from a planning perspective for, what I would call the data janitorial effort, planning, data validation, and data cleansing. So teams, I kind of see teams that get so excited to get in and perform analysis and come up with insights that they skip this extremely important phase of the project. And any leader would tell you that, an inaccurate insight that's done very quickly is just not a valuable thing. So it's not an exact science, but these charts are here to kind of show how teams need to reprioritize and realign their expectations when it comes to planning for a data analytics effort. A much more substantial amount of time needs to be applied in the planning phase, identifying what data is needed, cleansing that data, and validating the accuracy of the data before we actually go in and try to derive insights and create fancy dashboards at the end of a project. So this makes me think actually back to some continuous monitoring projects we were putting in place at Home Depot. I recall a very specific example where we were putting in place a T&E continuous monitoring analytic, and we didn't necessarily budget enough time in the planning phase and thinking about what the end result is going to be. So we developed the T&E analytic, dove straight into the analysis and testing phase too quickly. We got to the end of the project and we realized that we hadn't gotten access to the HR data that we needed that would facilitate following up on all of the exceptions were identified as a part of the analytic. So then we had to go back through the bureaucratic process of requesting access to the tables, waiting for access, identifying the tables we needed, reperforming some of the analysis we did to join in the right data. And we spent about a month going back through that process to get to the follow-up phase that we needed to. So simply by spending, I would call maybe the appropriate amount of time on that planning phase of the project, we would have been able to identify by thinking through what is the end deliverable, what is the end result, and what are we going to do with it, what data, and working backwards to what data we would actually need. We would have saved ourselves probably a month worth of waiting around before we could get to the actual results of what we're trying to do and follow up on all the issues. All right, so that brings us to the next area, and it's really about this. This focuses on planning for your team, and it's not only planning for your team, but it's planning for what is the overall goal, what's the roadmap for the data analytics, endeavor and initiative you're going upon. So, as is typical with any high growth industry, data analytics resources are extremely scarce. They're commanding new high level salaries. And too many teams, that really poses a challenge in trying to hire up a team, based on a current internal audit, resourcing model. The other thing I see is that too many teams develop job descriptions that are just generic. They get excited. We've got some resources we're going to spend on data analytics. They pull a kind of resource job description off the shelf, and they don't necessarily do that thinking through what all of their needs are going to be and what their goals are. So really teams, it kind of goes back to planning, where teams need to align their hiring plans to the strategic roadmap from a data analytics perspective to ensure that the people that are being hired will help address the needs and achieve those goals that they're going after. And I think that brings up another point, is that the process needs to be started by developing that strategic roadmap, thinking through where do we want to go in the next 1, 2, 3, and 5 years. And then working backwards to say, what are our goals at the end of those periods? And then, like I said, aligning the resource plan to make sure you're meeting those goals. And the other thing I would say is determining your target maturity level associated with your roadmap. That's going to help you drive things like the budgeting process. So how much of your department budget needs to be allocated to driving data analytics? Additionally, like I mentioned, you need to align your skill sets with your strategic goals. So I come across so many teams who just hire for that data analytic or data analyst and IT specialist type person that can, write a SQL statement or an ACL script, but they don't think about things like project management or business skills or even visual design skills. If you create a very compelling analysis, but it's not visually appealing or interactive from a dashboarding perspective, it may not have the impact or the adoption that you're really hoping for. And this chart isn't to say that you necessarily need one person for each of these skill sets, because it's not necessarily realistic to think of an audit shop having 8 dedicated data analytics people. But these skill sets are things that need to be considered as a part of your planning process. And make sure that, if it's half a person, 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, that you have good coverage across these skill sets. So that kind of, that from a case study perspective, thinking about examples, that makes me, think about a person that's, extremely strong, or a team that's extremely strong in one area, but extremely weak in another. And that can lead to some pretty glaring issues when you try to accomplish a task. So when I think about this, I think about hiring for a specific skill like data extraction and manipulation, but not thinking about the rest of the skills that you need to accomplish the overall goal. So, kind of like I alluded to earlier, maybe dashboarding and visualization are part of the goals for your team, and you don't have people on your team that can create that visually appealing and interactive dashboard. Another issue I see all too often is teams that dedicate a small portion of an existing resource to building out a data analytics capability. And it's usually the IT audit manager. The biggest cause, or for lack of results, I would say, is around this, where that IT audit manager gets 20% of their time dedicated to building out a data analytics function. But then other things come up along the way, and the IT audits are a must-do. They can't be deprioritized. So data analytics, like I said earlier, kind of gets deprioritized and lost in the shuffle. And that's not to say that all internal audit teams can devote an entire resource to data analytics. But if you can't, it's important to make this a part of the person's performance goals and hold them accountable to achieving those results. So it's not just a casual, John, the IT audit manager, is going to be our data analytics person, but it's tied to their goals. It's a part of the performance management process. And like I said, we hold them accountable to it. So the next area we'll talk about is around dirty data. It's pretty shocking to see the statistic we have on this slide, that 25% of data in organizations is considered dirty, so inaccurate, duplicate records, incomplete data. And as you can imagine, this has an extremely negative impact on the outcome of an analytics effort. Inaccurate analytics derived from dirty data can, obviously lead to poor business decisions, and nothing can derail a analytics effort faster than an inaccurate result leading to a poor business decision. So a couple of things come to mind when I think about dirty data and how to solve it. The first is leveraging internal audit's influence around governance, process, and controls to help drive better data accuracy. So doing things like data quality assessments and looking at the processes in the systems development lifecycle and QA processes to help drive better data governance and data accuracy. The second, and this recurring themes throughout what we're talking about today, is going back to the planning and data validation phases of an analytics project, which so often are easily neglected. So I think back to Home Depot, and we developed, to make sure that we accounted for this in every project, we developed pretty standard data validation techniques where we would leverage things like data triangulation or other data sources. So if we're going in and pulling sales data by department or by a product category, and we do some analysis and say that's 10% of all product categories, well, let's tie it back to the financial statements where we say sales were $80 billion and we should be about 10% of that. Are we in the ballpark? So applying things like sanity checks and leveraging other data sources to help identify where you might have data quality issues is a pretty effective technique. But it's got to be built into the project planning process to make sure you have the time allocated to do it. And applying, like I said, these standard kind of processes to make sure you're doing it consistently from project to project is very critical. So when I think about dirty data, it makes me think back to some analysis I was performing from a retail perspective. And we were trying to assess the performance, sales performance at an enterprise level before and after the implementation of a new fulfillment process. Were we getting the benefit out of the investment we made in implementing a new fulfillment process? So we pulled the sales data, we simply summed the sales, grouped it into pre and post implementation, and it was interesting because the post implementation numbers looked terrible compared to the pre numbers, which was counterintuitive because the initiative was supposed to improve sales. What we ended up finding out after we had presented the results was that one store had accidentally input SKU numbers into the sales field in manual purchases and drastically inflated the sales number. So if we had done some of this data validation and triangulation and looked for outliers in the raw data before we started grouping and aggregating things, we would have pretty quickly identified that there was an issue. But it was a rush project and we didn't devote the time necessary for data validation. So you'll see a theme that it comes back to budgeting and planning for this data validation effort in every project you do and implementing a standard process to do it. So the last area that we'll talk about is what we call outputs without insights. So I would say too many data analytics efforts get through all the phases of an analytics project and they don't realize the true benefits because the insights and actions driven by the analysis are they didn't leverage things like data visualization or put together a compelling analysis that drives the user to the answer that they were looking to get to. I think a large portion of analytics efforts could benefit from some of these newer emerging visual analytics technologies that are coming onto the market because they start to allow the end user, the business user, to get to their own insights, and it may not be something that somebody on the data analytics team would have thought about. And it lets people come to their own independent conclusions. So this is an example that I think back to where we had a theory that customers were taking advantage of a loophole in a process to defraud a retailer. And when we looked at the customer through standard analysis, as you can see in the bar charts, nothing really popped out as an outlier or something that was suspicious. kind of when you first look at it. Customer doesn't pop, location doesn't necessarily pop, and employees don't pop as something that is an outlier. And that's because you're categorizing it based off of predefined metrics or organizational alignment, org structures like stores, regions, and divisions. But when you start to look at it visually, it's very suspicious how all of a sudden there's no indicators across the whole country relative, the relative size. But when you look in the northwest corner, there's some pretty substantial bubbles. And when you drill into those specific areas, you'll see that there's just a couple customer IDs and a couple locations driving a lot of that activity. So as you can see, letting the geovisual type analysis speak for itself drove us to a much better conclusion than kind of the standard techniques that are used with charts and just segmenting data by org structures. Another key benefit to this, after building the analysis, putting it in the visual tool, and a small amount of automation, this tool was then able to be monitored, as a dashboard going forward. And the same person was identified coming back through different means to create the same type of fraudulent scenario. And we wouldn't have had that if we didn't go through a little bit of extra effort to put some automation in place and create a visual dashboarding tool. So the last area is really just thinking about applying these tools and techniques that we've talked about, applying it in what we kind of call the new analytics frontier, where it's leveraging this data and these analytics tools to derive insights out of the vast amount of information security data that's being collected in things like SIM tools. Visualizing these pieces of data and leveraging these tools can derive some significant value. An example, thinking about with information security is, leveraging these data analytics tools from a user access management perspective. So going the extra mile from a controls perspective with user access, performing a small amount of automation and visualization can lead to some pretty streamlined efficiencies when you're going in and testing these types of controls. Another area is something like security event monitoring. So think about things like an impossible traveler analysis, where somebody logs into a system in the US, maybe in Florida, and then an hour or two later that ID is being logged into in China. There's substantial volumes of information security data. And if you think about information security risks and applied data analytics, you can come to some pretty meaningful risk indicators. So, like we talked about in the beginning, the extreme growth from a data analytics perspective has made this a topic, conversation topic in pretty much every business. And like we saw, the application has not necessarily been in coordination with that conversation. So we're not applying the data analytics tools similar to the need we're seeing from a conversation perspective. So we definitely have a disconnect. So hopefully some of these tools and techniques we've talked about will help when you all start thinking about data analytics in your organizations. So I want to thank everybody today for joining us. We'll be sending a copy of the white paper that I wrote to everyone who attended, and I'd love to have some conversations with you all down the road. So at this point, if there's any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Yeah, we do have a few for you. Let me mute that. All right, so the first question was, what are the skills that a data analyst should have? And then a follow-on question, which is, what type of programming knowledge or what type of software analysis should they have?
Yeah, so I think that the skills question, like I talked about a little bit, I think it's too often narrowly thought about. So people go out and learn a skill like SQL, but they don't think about all of the other skills. I've had people that I've coached on my teams before where we talk about project management skills and organizational skills. You're not going to be able to create effective projects and results if you can't organize yourself and project manage yourself. So I think this slide kind of illustrates the skills that I would say are important. That's not to say that you have to have all of those, but you need to be able to have kind of a cross-section or a diverse skill and skill set across this board. And then from a program, I think the other question was around what programming languages are important.
That's correct.
Okay, so I hate to give the grad school answer on that, but it completely depends. You see a huge spike in technologies like, especially in the audit space, growth in technologies like SQL, R, Python. From an analytics perspective, I see a lot of the industry moving away from kind of your standard ACL and Arbutus and IDEA technologies into those more transferable skills like SQL and R and Python. And then other tools outside of just your programming language, things like data visualization tools, like your Tableau type tools. Being able to then take the results of analysis and put it into a visual, compelling format that like I said, can drive better adoption, will convince people to agree with what the analysis you've put forth.
Okay, good. There's some other ones here. What is good software example for visualization? You just kind of talked about Tableau and some other stuff. Any more input on some good software examples for visualization?
Yeah, I mean that's an exploding marketplace, and if you Google it, you'll come up with a ton. I like Gartner has if you look at Gartner's Magic Quadrant around visualization tools, you'll see things like Tableau are at the top, but there's a ton of other ones on there like ClickView, like Spotfire ClickView. They're all over the board, but my favorite thing to look at is that Gartner quadrant to say which are the ones I should be looking at. But I would say Tableau is probably the market leader in ease of use and what they call data painting, and is probably the most widely adopted.
Okay. Next question would be for an internal audit function just starting its data analytics program, what software should we look at? You may have already kind of covered that, but
yeah. Again, this is kind of I hate to fall back on this answer, but again, it really depends what your goals are. You need to start with that roadmap of where do we want to be in 5 years. Go back to the planning phase. What are our strategic goals in the next 1, 3, and 5 years? If those goals include things like visual analytics and predictive analytics, then tools like R and Tableau are going to be where you're going to want to go. If it's I want to put in place a more traditional continuous monitoring, continuous auditing environment like a lot of audit shops would have, then tools maybe more like your ACLs, IDEAs, Arbutus, SQL Server type environments might apply better. So I'd love to have more conversations around that specific to the goals of the organization, and that's actually something we help with fairly often is tool selection and trying to match tools to the goals of the organization. But like I said, it really comes back to create that roadmap of where do we want to be, and that should drive you to a lot of answers around what tools are going to be needed.
All right, we're getting a couple of the same topic here. The people are asking if the presentation will be available to download after the webinar.
Yeah, we can absolutely make the presentation available to download, and maybe we can send a link out along with the white paper after the presentation's over.
Yep, we can send everybody that attended today an email with both of those links, so you should look forward to that. And then another one here is how do you convince the audit executives that spending audit hours on developing robust data analytics is worth doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It goes back to the conversation we had around BuyIn. I think there's a couple ways to do it, and the simple answer is you could say follow the money. So one is grassroots efforts where you use data analytics, kind of like I talked about, where we just went and used data analytics without an investment. We found significant dollar savings, and that organically created BuyIn to invest further down the road. So that's one. The other is building that business case ahead of time to show the potential value, the potential financial windfall of an analytics endeavor. to get that buy-in on the front end. I think that's one, is showing the financial benefit. The other also relates to financial benefit, but it's talking about saving internal audit man-hours by becoming more efficient leveraging data analytics. So I talked a little bit about user access testing. So it's something we do every year. We do it basically the same way unless our scope changes. And there's data available to go pull and do the analysis in an automated way. We can go get user access listings, we can go get HR data, and we can plug into systems that have tickets that show approvals for users getting access to systems, and create an automated user access testing process that will save internal audit man-hours. So again, it's building a business case, but this isn't necessarily for saving the company from fraud, waste, and abuse. It's saving internal audit man-hours year over year by building an automated solution that's going to help make the audit function more efficient. And building that business case is a great way to get that buy-in.
Okay. Another question here: what are some metrics, i.e., KPIs, used to track effectiveness and efficiency of the efforts being made?
Yeah, I think that's a key point in audit data analytics efforts, or any data analytics effort. It's tracking the investment made, tracking whether it's cost savings or internal labor reallocation or labor savings. I would say that the metrics would be projects completed where data analytics was a key part of the results. Things like I said, cost savings attributed to performing data analytics. How many hours did we put in? What was our ROI for the cost savings that were attributed? But I think a pretty standard one that a lot of teams use just from in the start is just, like I said, the projects where data analytics was a critical portion of the success. But and it's not, those metrics I think should be tailored to every organization. But I think the real key is just tracking it. Where a lot of groups fail is they start down the data analytics path, and they don't create the process around where they're engaging, tracking what they're engaged on, and being able to report on it. So a lot of teams report nothing. When simply tracking it, you can create some fairly simple metrics that show the value that's being driven.
Okay, a few more here. Should data analytics be integrated into audits or as a standalone project?
That's a good question, and I think it's both. So, like I talked about at Home Depot some, data analytics was a part of every single project, and I think there's two ways to think about it. Where if you have a dedicated data analytics team, you can have them be, I call it two separate things. They're either one, a service organization. So the audit teams are off doing a project, and they let the data analytics team know what data is needed, and they kind of work in silos. And the data analytics team sends the results back, and the audit team goes on their merry way. The other, like I talked about, a support function, is more of a collaborative effort where the data analytics team is actually working hand in hand with those auditors or consultants or whatever they may be. And I think that model can produce much more meaningful results because it's more of a collaborative effort. You've got the data analytics person, you've got the business or the audit person in a room together working to solve a problem. So I like to see an integrated approach where it's more of the support function and they're working collaboratively.
Okay. Two more. For a very small IA department, one-person shop, where do you suggest we start? With an ACL type tool?
Yeah, I'm going to say it depends again.
Yeah.
I think it depends on, do you have anybody with knowledge in any of these tools? If you have somebody that has knowledge in SQL, I would start there. If you have somebody that has some knowledge in ACL, same concept applies. Or do you have some licenses? But again, even if you're a small shop and you're just getting started, you've got to think further down the road than just this first project. So what, if you have success in this, what are your long-term goals going to be? And I think that will drive, that decision for you. but yeah, I mean the ACL type tools are a better, I would say, an easier tool to get started with, because there's a lot of functionality where it's just, it's menu driven. You don't necessarily have to write code right off the bat. You can click on the data menu and hit summarize, and you don't necessarily need as advanced of a user to start things off.
Okay. And this might be already answered, but there was another question here. What strategy do you adopt for DA? I'm assuming that's data analytics.
Yeah, so I think that can be kind of a pretty broad question where I think it goes back to that roadmap I talked about. You've got to think about where do you want your program to be? What are your goals? And we, the roadmap I built that when we strategized on data analytics at Home Depot started with just pretty simple people, process, and technology. It started with our goals, and then we aligned people, process, and technology to those goals. So we, 5 years down the road, we wanted to have an advanced visual and automated analytics function that was a support organization to collaborate with internal audit, and also enabled internal auditors to independently do analytics. So there were added training components that maybe wouldn't apply in other groups where it's going to be that more service organization. So I think it goes back to getting the key players in a room, brainstorming, coming up with what are the goals for this data analytics effort, a couple years down the road, and then you've got to work backwards to figure out, what tools and technologies you need, what human resources you need, and things like training and technology.
All right, and one more. Is there such a designation as being a certified data analyst?
There absolutely are. So there is a certified data analyst. I think you can Google that one. That's more of a general topic. And then there's other certifications that are specific to technology. So Tableau has training courses and certification processes that are very valuable. ACL has an ACDA, an ACL certified data analyst. So the answer is absolutely yes, but it depends on the where you're headed and the tools and technologies you're using. And there's other things like certified fraud examiners that may not necessarily apply directly to data analytics, but if you're going now, if you're interested in using data analytics in the fraud space, could be extremely valuable certification to add to your belt.
All right, well, I think that's it, Cliff. So just a reminder for everybody out there, expect an email with 3 links to the slides, the recorded webinar, and the white paper that Cliff has developed. And also when we conclude, there's going to be a short 3 to 5 question feedback form we'd like your input on to see how we did, as well as if you have questions that didn't get answered or you didn't get in before we concluded, feel free to reply back to that follow-up email we're going to send, and we'll get some answers back for you. So I'll hand it off to Cliff to close out.
Yeah, that's it. I appreciate everybody joining, and feel free to. We'll include my email in the email that goes out, and feel free to reach out with any questions. And like I said, I'd love to have some additional conversations about this. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.